everybody. Welcome to the second English episode of Across the Pond, where we, Vytautas from Lithuania and Povilas from Chicago, USA, will talk across the pond that we call the Atlantic and discuss various topics of American, European, and sometimes global political life. For our first episode, we talk about crime in US. Now we want to talk about what seems to be the most important topic for the US government today, and that is climate change. And straightforwardly, Povilas, I want to ask, what do you think? Is there climate change?
Vytautas, good to see you again and talk to you. Absolutely. Our planet was formed billions of years ago, billions of years before man arrived on the planet. And every second and every day of that period, there was climate change, and there will be continued climate change as long as this Earth exists.
So what are the issues then? What is the dispute about if it's so perpetual?
Well, there is a climate change lobby, if you may want to call that. It covers three basic areas: science, economics, and politics. And that's where the dispute arrives. And before we discuss any of those issues, Vytautas, you and I both agree, I think, that we want clean air and clean water. We also want clean energy. That is very important. The other thing that's very important, that's often overlooked, is that pollution. Yes, man causes some pollution, but the pollution is not just regional. It covers the whole planet. So let's say Lithuania decided to pollute the air. It would not stay just in Lithuania. The pollution travels around the globe. And those are very important concepts, and that's where some of the dispute begins.
Before going to the certain examples, I'd like to stop at those three dimensions you mentioned: politics, economy, right, and
Science.
Science. Which would be the first, logically? Politics?
Well, I think first would be the science, because politics and economics always relies on science. At least that's what politicians and what the economists claim. And that's where we get into trouble. Science, historically, and of its essence, has to be challenged. Every hypothesis, every theory in science must be challenged and re-challenged. Unfortunately, in case of climate change, once this climate change scientists declare something, the debate is shut off. And anybody that criticizes the science or its conclusions or its models is immediately labeled as climate change denier and is shut off the debate. And since politics and economics base it on science, the conclusions have to be corrupted because the premises are corrupted. That's the way I see the whole debate in all three of those areas.
So there is a political, at least for me as a political scientist, I already see political aspect of it. If science is one-sided, let's say, if some part of the discussion is shut off, there must be political reasons for that. What would be the camps here? If there is a discussion, what are the camps? We already denied the one saying that there is no climate change. We agree that climate change there is. Then what is there to discuss about on scientific level?
Well, when you talk about politics, I must take example of American politics. The so-called climate lobby insists on immediate, irrevocable change from fossil fuels to quote-unquote clean energy. In fact, there is no clean energy. We still haven't discovered any. solar and wind, all of those processes have some pollution tied to it. But the politics of clean earth or climate change politics in the United States is based on theory that if we destroy fossil fuels and turn to wind and solar and hydraulic, we will have absolutely clean air and clean water. Now, Vytautas, we both agree we want clean water and clean air. No doubt about it. We also want clean energy. But that transition, even if possible, cannot be made overnight. So the economics in the United States is that we must change immediately. The consequences are absolutely disastrous both for the United States and for the free world, as we can see. We can go into details, but the announcement that climate change will be dominant in American politics was declared by President Biden when he was campaigning for presidency. He promised and swore to his loyal supporters that he will destroy fossil fuels in America, in the United States. And ever since he became president, starting the very first day, he started the war on fossil fuels. Unrealistically, because the transition from fossil fuels to so-called clean energy, as he dreams of, is impossible without considering the immense costs and disorder in those society, economic and business and daily life.
Now, before going into detail and putting the question if the transition towards life without fossil fuel is possible, let's leave it aside. I have another question. Is there even a promise of success? Let's say we get rid of fossil fuels, we do everything that people like Greta Thunberg is demanding to do. Do they say that there is a possibility to stop that climate change, well, from the human part?
Well, that's where we get into science and the models that the scientists use. We have to realize that climate change science is based on models which are theoretical and hypothetical, and based on research and science that's being blocked off from the debate. If we eliminate all the human pollution, by the end of the century, the result would be absolutely minute in temperature change and ocean levels. Ocean levels would rise by a couple inches or very little. The temperature would drop, rise only by fraction of 1 degree Fahrenheit. So even with the best calculations and complete effort at elimination of fossil fuels, the results would be absolute minute.
That's where I become somehow lost in this debate, because if the position of, let's say, Paris Agreement is to eliminate fossil fuel and kind of stop the industry the way it's going now, and the promise is to just slow that changes a little bit, but not stop them, not reverse them, then logical conclusion would be that it's not a good way to go. It's not something we should try. We should try different roads of this situation, other different roads of this situation.
Well, if you look at the politics and economics of Paris and Paris Treaty and the climate change lobby, we must realize that it's more a financial issue and a fight against Western capitalism and destruction of our economic system. The debate is not about climate change, but the debate is how to fund the change. And the West, Europe and the United States are giving in, starting on a defensive position and agreeing that we, United States and Europe, mostly United States, would fund the rest of the world as it turns from fossil fuels to clean energy. And it's really based on economics and funding the lobby more than doing anything at all about changing climate.
And right here, to me, it seems like a right place for a question. How does it affect our daily lives?
Well, Vytautas, you know what's happening in Europe right now. Europe is running out of energy and looking forward to a cold and miserable winter, closing down of some of its European factories, etc. That is one of the results of the climate change lobby and the business and economics of climate change. And I think Germany is a good example in Europe. Germany, influenced by the Greens, by the climate change lobby, eliminated its nuclear energy sources, cut off gas as much as possible, and was turning away from oil. What happened now when Putin shut off oil and gas? Germany is vulnerable more than anybody in Europe because it relies on its industry and exports. And now it doesn't have energy to power its manufacturing and even living standards. So what's happening as a result? They're turning back to the dirty fuels of coal, even wood burning. And all of that was done because of the enthusiastic turning away from fossil fuels and clean energy, of nuclear clean energy, to climate change acceptable sources, wind and solar. United States is not in such a bad position, but what happened in the United States is affecting Europe and is affecting the rest of the world. President Biden kept the only promise that he made in his campaign, and that is to try to destroy the fossil fuel industry, energy industry in the United States. In effect, he succeeded. He reduced the production of oil and gas and pipelines in the United States. As a result, the United States has become importer of energy, whereas 2 years ago, it was exporting gas and oil, especially liquid gas, to Europe and other countries in the world. If the United States would have continued on the trend that President Trump started, we would now be able to support Europe this winter. But because of the climate change policies, which has overtaken every major United States department, including the Defense Department, United States is closing down its production, is begging Venezuela, Iran, and even Russia to produce more dirty oil so that United States can import that dirty oil because we refuse to accept our own clean production. And this is going back to the original principle that pollution is not regional, pollution is global. So if we import oil from Venezuela, which is by far the dirtiest in the world, the pollution that Venezuela causes travels around the globe. Meanwhile, we're shutting down United States production, which is probably the cleanest in the world. So it's Don Quixote working against windmills, in this case, working for the windmills and destroying the economy.
For me, and I guess many of us here in Europe, it would be interesting to hear if you could explain in more detail how Biden's administration is destroying that gas and oil industry. Are their policies affected?
Well, the very first day that President Biden was sworn in, his very first order was to cut off, for instance, the Keystone Pipeline. Europeans may not know about Keystone Pipeline. It was a pipeline being built to transfer safely oil from Canada to American seaports, Houston, to refine it and then export it to Europe and the rest of the world. Canada has a surplus of oil. United States has the capacity to refine it. The oil from Canada, if it doesn't go through the pipelines, has to go by railroads, which is not as safe as the pipelines. And it has to travel hundreds of miles west to western coast to be shipped to China, instead of being shipped to Houston, refined, and then shipped to Europe. And that was the first day order. Afterwards, United States federal government owns about 25% of United States land. And on much of that land, there is oil and gas resources. United States government leases that land to oil companies to produce oil. Number one, Biden's government started blocking off areas from which oil would be refined, dug. He closed off huge areas of federally owned land. Secondly, prohibited building new pipelines. So therefore, even on the lands that he leases, the oil companies cannot get permits. And if they get permits, they cannot get pipelines. And therefore, they're paralyzed from bringing that oil that's totally available and gas that could fuel all of Europe from the ground. As a result, United States production, which should be at 14 million barrels per day, is down to 11.5, close to 12 million. 2 million barrels a day short of what it could be based on the way the oil industry and the gas industry was organized by President Trump and open policies. That has a direct effect on Europe and the rest of the world. The United States has created a shortage of oil, which increases the prices, which causes the inflation. And now this policy is the best friend for Putin, who in turn is using gas and oil as political and strategic tool against Europe. And therefore, this blind policy of climate change-based fight against fuels is causing international inflation, recession, and terrible consequences which Putin and China are using against the free world.
My next question would have been, who are the biggest winners of this policy in the United States? It's Putin and China?
Putin is winner number one. China is winner number two. Iran is winner number three. Venezuela is winner number four. All shady, evil empires.
Now Europe seems to be like caught in the middle, right? Of course, there is in itself European green agenda, and European countries, especially leading ones, in the European Union are working hard to develop their green agenda, and there are plans in motion, I would say, from European Commission to go become only reliable on renewables instead of fossil fuel. But Europe was doing it, I would say, in a very wrong way, being extremely dependent on Russian gas, oil, and everything, being happy with the prices and not thinking about the future and dependency as a problem in itself. I couldn't say what they were thinking in long term. Angela Merkel just recently said that she thinks that her decisions were right ones. It was a rational thing to do. Even now, she claims that it was the right thing to do to buy from Russia. She even said that even in the Cold War times, Soviet Union was a reliable resources producer. She had no reason to think that Russia could be unreliable, and so she stays with her decisions as the right ones. And I'm not sure. What I'm afraid of is that Europe, even though it's working hard to increase their renewable productions, it's still ready to get back to the Russian pipe just after the war ends in one way or another.
Well, Germany has always historically problem of dealing friendly with Russia, even with Soviet Union dating back to Stalin times. I think Merkel is wrong. I think Germany made a terrible mistake by switching away from nuclear and even its own gas production. Germany could produce gas on its own soil in a clean way, as opposed to the dirty gas and oil that comes from Russia. And obviously, Russia is not a reliable partner for anything, for any commercial or political purposes. Russia, especially under Putin, is totally unreliable. But the idea that Germany would go green by closing down its nuclear and yet accepting dirty Russian oil and gas somehow lives in a fantasy land. Yes, Germany will be clean as long as they can use dirty Russian oil and gas. So there's a certain kind of blindness in this whole process, which I mentioned to you privately when we discuss borders on a religion. Climate change religion, where everything is based on hope and wish and belief, and cutting off real science and reality, and understanding the costs of trying to close down the most successful economic system in history of the world, closing it down and going back centuries to the old system and hoping. Everything is based on hope that somehow we'll be able to have absolutely clean energy, without realizing that solar and wind, to produce solar and to produce, for instance, electrical cars, even the windmills, requires tremendous amount of resources and minerals and destruction of the earth process. No energy that we're using is absolutely clean, not even solar. And look in Europe, for instance, solar farms cannot find locations in Europe because they need a lot of space and they have to use up farmland and green areas. Same thing with windmills, like in the United States. The progressives and their billionaire friends want windmills everywhere except on their land, except per seashore, where the biggest promoters of global warming in windmills live, including Kerry, our global warming and global climate change czar, and Gore and President Obama. They all live on the ocean side in their huge mansions, and they don't want solar They don't want windmills. Those should be built somewhere else among the poor people. So there's a religious type of fanaticism which is really destroying our economies.
Yes, to me, inconsistencies in that perspective are too big to really understand and explain in just some kind of religious fanaticism. You know, where when a country like Germany tries to become more green and closes its nuclear reactors, which are, I guess we will agree, the greenest energy there is. When a country goes from one resource to another without considering that every energy resource, every way of producing it has its ups and downs, right? There are downsides of solar and wind energy. When, let's say, those countries which are actually polluting less now decide to cut their pollutions even more without demanding the same from the developing countries, so-called developing countries like China, India, and so on, I cannot expect that people making those decisions are somehow not rational, incapable of rational decisions, incapable of seeing those inconsistencies. There must be something else. And I usually like explanations in ideology in the field of political ideas, but I cannot find strong enough ones here. Then I'm starting to think about that thing you mentioned before, business, lobby. Maybe that's the case here. Maybe there is just such a strong lobby for those.
Well, for instance, in the United States, there's a huge pressure to build electrical cars and solar systems and windmills. Electrical car battery minerals come from China almost exclusively. Windmill materials for windmills come from China, and they're built in China. Solar systems are 90% produced in China. So United States is funding China, which is the biggest global and military opponent of the free world and the United States. We're funding them. By cutting off oil, we're funding Putin, whose economy is based on oil, and the more expensive oil, the more he's got money to fight Ukrainians. The whole thing is irrational. And I think, Vytautas, we must agree that we should be looking forward to clean energy. And I hopefully somewhere in the future we develop energy from air, completely clean. However, we have to do it rationally. And until we're in position to go completely green, we cannot shut off the sources that have made Western world the most successful in the history and has raised the standards of living in the world to levels that never even dreamt of. And it's ridiculous to destroy it. Now, as far as the climate change arguments are concerned and the lobby, my wish is that we would get more facts and open debate. Right now, the debate is one-sided. Anyone that criticizes climate change lobby is shut off from media, shut off from social media, and is considered climate deniers, which is wrong. And we need the openness and we need the debate. That's my wish.
I guess that's the best way to sum up our, well, kind of introductory conversation this time. Do not be a climate change deniers. Let us look for many ways to make this situation better and not stick to one religious explanation, that complex situation we have now. Thank you, Povilas, for our episode.
Pleasure, Vytautas.
Good luck and looking forward to hear you again across the pond.
Thank you.